Good evening, welcome to the Future of Education. Thank you so much for coming to join myself and Robin tonight. It's wonderful to see you all here. Tonight we're going to be talking about storytelling, and in particular storytelling within veterinary education. Robin is joining us, he is a keynote author, a keynote speaker and an author of best-selling books. Robin, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and keep it sort of fairly brief, but so kind of going back to my university days, I actually started life as a systems analyst, same time as getting my degree for 4 years. And I know we're here to talk about veterinary, but it's useful probably just for people to get a bit of a feeling for kind of what it was that I did. So 4 years as a systems analyst, and then I set up my first proper business in 2004 and did web design and branding. And when we started to get into the branding side of things, that was my first opportunity to really start to understand the clients that we worked with, like how story impacts not just businesses but the wider world in general. So we used to get to know what, you know, their core values, their vision, their mission, and all of that good stuff, and the amazing work which they did for their clients. And it was I started to discover during the 12 years that we ran that agency that it was all very much based around story, you know, past, present and future, and each of those sort of stages there is some kind of a story creation process going on. And it was around about 2016 I sold the agency, not for a lot of money, just, you know, modest sum, and set up my coaching practice. And I realised sort of during that process I wrote 2 books, which I think we're obviously going to talk a bit about those. And it was in the transition between the first and the second book where I had a full-on epiphany about what it really takes to create some kind of a meaningful transformation. And how you actually then go about taking somebody on a journey from A to B, and a majority of that is basically through storytelling. So yeah, I hope we're gonna chat about that quite a bit this evening.
Yeah, absolutely. So really tonight, the purpose of tonight is to give you all a little bit more of an understanding about how we can use storytelling, and in particular how we can use that to improve the way that we teach and the way that our students learn. What we'll do is we're going to talk for about half an hour, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to come to those and talk to you about those. And we've also got a little bit of a bonus for you, so stick around for that. Really, I suppose we probably should sort of start off like why I'm really passionate about education. So for me, the reason I think that this is so important is that I had quite a tricky journey through education. When I was a teenager, I couldn't read till I was 14. I'm really severely dyslexic, and I needed all sorts of educational support. I was taught at home till I was about 15, and then when I went into mainstream education, I really kind of needed an awful lot of support to fit in with this system, this whole educational system that was there. I needed people to help me write, people to read, proofread my assignments and help me in exams. And the big thing with that was that I was able and intelligent, but I was really struggling with the system. And I didn't do GCSEs or A levels, but I was lucky that I really went through a vocational route and got into vet school. I banged on the door and got into vet school. When I got into vet school, I was part of the first foundation year at Nottingham, and the whole course just worked for me. It was at a point where there was a system they had that just made the way I would learn, it just fitted, and I didn't need any more educational support to get through the course. And what I'd seen there was one side of things where there was a system that I had to fit into, and then the other side where it just worked. And fast forward, 15, 20 years, and I'm a European specialist and I'm an assistant professor. I've got to a point where I think that I would love to be able to help make veterinary education just work for us with our CPD and our postgraduate training, because so much of it at the moment is perhaps a little bit unengaging or a little bit dry, and if we could try to improve that, that would be a great thing for the way that we teach and the way that our students learn. So I suppose we were going to jump in today and we were going to talk about your book, Take Your Shot, weren't we? Yeah. So do you want to tell us about Take Your Shot and kind of like why particularly we're talking about this book?
Yeah, so Take Your Shot's actually the second book which I wrote. The first book was it's a book called Online Business Startup. It fit very much around sort of the agency work which I used to do, but it was very much like a 45,000 words, very dry how-to book about getting a business up and running, getting online and then marketing it. And a lot of the feedback I used to get about that book was very much in the vein of, we can absorb a chapter at a time. It was very linear. So somebody would read a chapter, go away and try and implement it, come back, and they felt that they weren't really able to get to the real meat, because the key milestone things which I wrote in the book, the bits which made the biggest impact, were kind of sprinkled at various kind of points throughout the book. So when I then set up the coaching practice, I was like, right, I've got to come up with something, a concept for a book, an idea that one is going to engage people. I wanted a book that was emotive, so that as a reader you could empathise with the characters in the book. So we really personified Russ, who is the main character in the book, David, who is the coach that he meets on his journey. And I tell a very emotional sort of story about how, even the first page of the book, you start to get a picture of, Russ wakes up in the dark at 5 a.m. He's got to drive a couple of hours to get to the golf course because he's a golf professional, to get to the golf course where he teaches. And he has to de-ice his car and he doesn't want to he's got a young family, he doesn't want to wake them up. So you're kind of living Russ's life, right from the word go. And the lovely feedback which I get about that is that the fact that many of the people who read Take Your Shot, they're like, that it feels like you were talking about me. So it's like, great. So mission accomplished in terms of that empathy in the characters. The second thing as well is there are so many business books, and a lot of people never get round to writing a book because their attitude is, oh, there's already business books out there, why me? And I was like, everybody has a unique story to tell. So for me, one, I wanted that story which people could, and the characters that people could empathise with and place themselves into that story. But two, it's really important that through the story, people learn, there's 5 sort of core coaching concepts within that book around sort of growing a business. And I wanted it to be effortless. I wanted people to read those bits, the key parts of the educational side of it, without realising that they'd actually read those bits, they'd actually read something educational, if that makes sense. Yeah, so it just kind of really blended in with part of the story. And then the third thing was, all the business books out there, they're tomes. They're just like Tolkien-esque type, 50, 60, 70,000 words. And let's be fair, in 2022, we live in a world where it's so fast paced. We're flooded with the news and the media and social media. And as a 40-year-old man, dad, husband, I live a very fast-paced, frenetic life. I don't have time to sit down and read, a book which could take 7, 8, 9, 10 hours to get through, plus remember all of those key learning points from it. So Take Your Shot, it's only a short, pithy book. It's 100 pages and you can read it in a couple of hours. Yeah. And that was vital. It was really important that when people picked up that book, they got from the right from the beginning to the end of it, ideally within one sitting, that they got the 5 key learning objectives out of the book, and they enjoyed the process of reading a book.
Yeah, I think that's the thing for me. The reason I want you to come tonight to talk about Take Your Shot is that, for me, when you read this book in particular, and I've read quite a few books on business, and God knows how many books I've read on textbooks and technical work and case studies and journal papers. And some of those that they need to be technical, and there's reasons why we use that language. But the reason why for this book particularly for me was that it was so interesting is because there are some quite complex topics in here, but you break them down in such a way that makes them really accessible. Yeah. And you couldn't really put it down. It's kind of this cliche people say about these books, but genuinely I was really intrigued to keep, I had the audiobook version and I couldn't stop listening to it. And it's just interesting to see that you can wrap up these complex topics in a story to make to a point where you really understand it. Yeah. I thought that was a really interesting way you approached that.
Well, again, that's part of my coaching philosophy, is about simplifying things. So I did a business management degree at the same time as I was doing the systems analysis work. And I just remember being sat in a lecture theatre, listening to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all of these models which these very clever people had come up with, but just was, as a student, 20-year-old student, just really boring, like quite uninteresting and dull. And yes, there is a practical kind of case when you actually get out into the business world and you start to try and apply these things. There was some relevance there, but it just wasn't interesting. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't something that you could actually really get excited about engaging with. So for me, like my goal with all of so I have about my coaching program. I know this isn't necessarily about my coaching program. This is about the story element of it. But to give some context, I have about 40 or 50. So I mentioned there's 5 tools in there. I have about a toolkit of about 40 or 50 different tools which I use, in my day-to-day sort of coaching life now. And every single one of them it's a variation on a theme of complex ideas that I'm able to drill down into a simple diagram. So, it's very, very visual. That's a very important part of it. So that I can actually draw it out there and then with the client and take them on a 5 or 10 minute journey with me. Almost telling a story as you go. And so that whole process of just breaking a complex subject down into a 5 or 10 minute, effectively a TED talk on one idea. Yeah. That's the whole sort of purpose of what I do.
So I think that's really interesting, because one of the things you touch on there is this 5 or 10 minutes, this short attention, this short kind of parcel of explanation, knowledge, and then kind of understanding. Because like our attention spans are so much shorter than they used to be. I mean, goodness knows. I mean, the smartphone is so responsible for this reduction in our attention span. Yeah. And I think as educators, we have to be really aware of that, because there's got to be a way that we can teach where we're not going to totally flood our students. Because you mentioned that your first book was 45,000 words. So something that's like that, the temptation tends to be when we're teaching, and I'd be interested if anyone to mention this in the chat. So when you're teaching, when you first started teaching, do you deliver more now, or did you deliver more when you first started teaching? It'd be interesting to see what comes up here. Yeah. Because I know that when I first started teaching, I would deliver loads. I would massively over deliver. I would put a huge amount in there. So we're getting a few in there. More. We're getting a few. So some people deliver more now. It's really interesting that. So really, I'm getting loads in. That's what we're saying. So less now. Slowly reducing, about the same. Reduce less on webinars. Okay, less now. Definitely cut down now. Okay, that's really cool. It's really interesting to hear that's resonating with people, because I think the temptation is when we deliver knowledge to students, what we hope happens is that we say, okay, here's a concept. I'm going to tell you the concept, and then I'm going to tell you lots of detail, and I give you as much detail as I can. I want to give you really thorough learning on this topic, and then hopefully they will learn a lot. And unfortunately, in my experience, what I see that happens is that we deliver lots of knowledge, and we deliver detail, and we deliver so much to the students that they can't take it in, and they're overwhelmed by it, and therefore we don't actually get more learning, we get less learning because they can't take it away, and especially if we're doing something that's long form and online. So, I mean, it's a really interesting concept where if you look at some of the really great online providers at the moment, a really great example of this is Masterclass. These guys who are doing short courses where they've got really big celebrities, like they've got Samuel L. Jackson teaching acting, or they've got Chris Voss teaching negotiation, or they've got Gordon Ramsay teaching cooking. Now I know those aren't veterinary examples, but what they've hit on is that they use really short packages where you can watch a little bit, you can go away. If you're feeling driven, you go and watch some more, but essentially you can go at your own pace to get more out of your attention span.
I think what it comes down to, it's more about creating a certain level of understanding. So we understand what the end goal is. By the end of getting to a training, you want somebody to have understood a concept. Whether they can actually then put it into practice straight away is a different matter. That's why it's then called practice. You have to go away, take the principles and put them into practice. And then, if you think about the 4 stages of learning, So from unconscious incompetence right the way through to unconscious competence, like learning to drive. You don't know what you don't know. That's the first starting point. And then you get into the car and now you start to realize, okay, things start to make sense, but you're really focused on shifting gear. You're really focused on like looking in the mirror, and you go over the top because now you've reached that point of conscious incompetence where you kind of like getting very wary around everything that's going on with you, and you need to concentrate. But it's then gradually over the process of the next year or 2 or 3 years of actually sitting in that car and driving several tens of thousands of miles, that eventually you get to a point whereby it just happens naturally. But all you need to, that's why you do the theory test first. All you've got to understand is the theory. You don't need to understand necessarily exactly all of the every single fine detail about it. And I think that's where a lot of training these days tends to fall down, because they could just go so heavy on the detail. Yeah. I mean, it's some very simple stats. I'm sure some of the people watching will be very familiar with these stats. Every second, a human being takes in 21 million data points. Okay, just in terms of all of our 5 senses and everything going on around us. Okay. How many of those do you think we actually retain?
Like 10.
Less than that, between 3 and 7 out of 21 million data points every second. So it's quite fascinating. If you imagine then if in like a 40-minute presentation, you bombard with people with so many different concepts and ideas, they're not going to be able to retain that just by virtue of the fact that it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we if we're trying to do something that's really technical. So let's say like we're trying to explain something that's an important clinical detail. We're trying to say, how do you manage a specific condition, or we're trying to say diagnosis, or we're trying to say a surgical procedure. Like, how do the question comes, well, if I can't give people a lot of detail, how am I going to actually tell them this? Because you're saying that I can't give this detail.
The key thing is actually humans are very clever like beings, right? So the key thing is allow your students to fill in some of the blanks for themselves. Okay, so just as a simple example of this, a little exercise which Toby and I prepared. Okay, so it's going to be a bit weird for us to do it here because it's just you and me. So we're going to have a quiet moment together. Okay. But for those of you at home, just go with us. Just try out this little exercise. What I want you to do is just close your eyes for a moment. Okay, and literally just one very simple instruction. I want you to remember or imagine a dog. Okay, just have a picture in your brain of a dog. Okay, sit with that for 5 or 10 seconds. And probably what's happening is you're starting to, your brain is actually starting to create a bit of a story itself. Maybe it's starting to imagine that you're outdoors, that there's some trees around, maybe you can hear some pigeons, cooing off in the distance. There's a stream fluttering back. So your brain will have this picture of this specific dog, okay? Now what I want you to do is just pop in the chat, okay? And I want to know what breed of dog was it and what colour was it, okay? And this just highlights the point that there's one simple concept that we've given you here, but what I'm expecting to see in the chat when it starts to come through, so we've got Black Labrador, Dalmatian, Black Lurcher, Golden Setter, Cocker Jack. Yeah, so this is one idea. Just imagine a dog. Now we've got hundreds of different variations on a theme where the human brain has kind of filled in all the gaps. They've plugged the gaps, okay? So that's the first thing. Second thing, what I want you to do is that dog, when you imagined it, did you know the dog? Was it your dog? Was it a relative's dog, a friend's dog? Was it just a dog that you made up? And here's an interesting point. Did anybody think of Scooby-Doo during that exercise? Right? Now I missed off one important piece of information there, was if I had invited you to imagine a cartoon dog, just a little bit of extra detail, probably somebody would have come up with Scooby-Doo. Oh, somebody has put yes.
Yeah, Louise.
Yep, so we did have a couple of Scooby-Doos in there.
Oh, someone said Scooby-Doo, yep.
Pluto, brilliant. Things like that. So, okay, so a few of you. Now, it was actually a mentor that demonstrated this exercise to me during a talk several years ago. And what he did is we did that first exercise initially, and then he played a video for us, okay? And it was of him and his black lab going for a walk, and you could see the back of Martin's back, plus his dog running up past him, beside him, and around him, and all sorts of things like that. So then all of a sudden we kind of had context. And you can start to, and he started to share with us this story about, how he'd obviously got this dog as a puppy and the life, and his children had grown up with this dog. And so now there's all this there's a lot of emotional stuff starting to sort of weigh in on this picture as well. So not only have we got our imagination, we've got our 5 senses, but now we also have feelings. This is where we get into audio, visual and kinesthetic learning, right? So we're going, now we're going like 7 layers deep into the whole experience. And that, in essence, that is what education is about. It should be an experience. It shouldn't just be a one-way radio transmission. It should be an experience. Now, Martin went on to tell during the story about how then obviously the dog came to the end of its life, and they had to have the dog put down. I actually still get quite emotional because when he told the story, my mum's dog had to be put down as well, and I took her to the vet with Bobo. So there was a lot of emotion sort of welling up inside me at the time. Probably as I'm expressing this story, that will also be evoking a different emotional reaction as well. Possibly some of you may have gone through an experience like that, had your dog put down, and maybe your dog's poorly at the moment. And there's all of this different sort of experience, and it's actually that experience which is the thing which actually, for me, locks in a great deal of the understanding and learning. And sometimes I think we're too busy just going through, following a formula, and a linear path, that we forget about, we're still human at the end of the day, and it's that, that whole storytelling and emotive sort of experience which actually we're really yearning for.
I think it's really interesting because you've done talk about a story there. It's actually quite a short story, and it's really interesting to kind of hear the detail you've gone into there. And we talk about the different styles of learning. We've got visual learners, auditory learners, and kinesthetic learners. And one of the ways that we can actually make sure that the learning we're providing actually works for all different learners is that we can provide, we can explain something. So that helps for a auditory learner. We can show video or pictures, and that works for those people who are visual learners. We can put text on a slide. Oh God, that's a whole different topic. PowerPoint, not for tonight, but that's a whole different subject. But for those people who are kinesthetic learners, actually, we talk about story and storytelling being something that's this sort of amorphous subject. But actually, what we can do is we can use storytelling to get people to experience what we're talking about, and that helps them to really to learn about it. And it's funny the impression it can make on people, because this model that I spoke about earlier of saying concept, lots of detail, and then learning, I like to flip that. I do it in a different way, and I think that the really powerful thing that we can do as subject matter experts and specialists in our respective fields is that we can try to, rather than deliver knowledge for our students and say, well, we're here to give them knowledge. Actually, that's not the most valuable thing we can do. They can get that off all sorts of different types of learning. They can get it from books, they can get it from podcasts, we can get it from different videos. But actually, what our job is, and the thing that we're really suited at, is actually helping them with understanding. And the understanding we can give them is something that is something that's invaluable, because the way that we can tell a story, because we've got those experiences, and we can deliver a concept, explain a little bit, tell them a story around that, and therefore we go from concept to experience within that story and then understanding.
Yeah,
I think it's in my teaching experience, I just found it's a really powerful way to explain things, especially some concepts that are really complicated.
That's it. And the audio-visual kinesthetic learning is actually only a small part of the way that humans kind of understand things as well. So there's 2 other key parts to it. So the first one is left and right brain thinking. So left brain logical, right brain creative. It's fine if you give somebody the textbook and deliver, and it's very linear. That suits somebody who is left brain logical, and they can follow instructions effectively. Yep. If that makes sense. Where actually you end up with somebody who is right brain more creative, they actually need the experiential learning because that feeds that creative side of their brain. If you think about, we looked at an infographic earlier on of left and right, and I hope maybe we can try and find a way to share it with everybody later. But it's like left brain was very ordered, and it was very like, you know, it had sums and maths in it and the numbers, and it was all just very orderly. And the right side of the brain, as they'd done it, was just like crayons and mess and colour and just like all of this like kind of ordered chaos going on. And so that's why like one style of content delivery is not going to suit everybody. So you need to mix it up. You need to keep it interesting. You need to bring a different energy to it. You need to be able to find a way to paint pictures in people's minds by the words which you use, the activities which you get them to do, and various things like that. Imagine, and it leads me on to my second point as well. So when I asked people to picture a dog, there was a raft. There was pretty much every breed on the planet in there.
No papillons.
No papillons. Yeah, there we go. So, but there you go. So now that's my point. You felt alienated because there were no papillons. Imagine now if we spent 30 minutes like doing a presentation on Labradors, specifically black Labradors. There was a few people who thought of a black lab, but potentially were alienating all of the rest of the audience. So you can't please everybody, it's hard, but at least you can mix the content enough so that it's interesting enough for most people, or majority of the audience. And from that, so whenever I deliver a talk, right, or whenever I...
Oh, Rob Fole, thanks Rob. Yeah, Papillon, yeah.
There we go. So there's at least two of you in the world. Excellent. One of the key things I always try and I remind people, so whenever I do a talk, whenever I encourage somebody to read a book or watch a video or something like that, try and pick out the 2, 3, 4 things out of that learning experience which are most relevant to you. Ones that you feel that, not just that you get the key understandings from, but you can actually put into practice straight away. Because essentially what that comes down to is like motivation. So if there's less friction and you get to the understanding and the practice sooner, the faster then you can start to sort of practice mastery. You can exactly. So alongside audio, visual, kinesthetic type ways of learning. Definitely think left brain, right brain, because you're going to have a variety of different audiences that you're kind of speaking to. And then finally, try not to alienate your audience by being so focused on what you think is the most important thing. It has to cover a variety of experiences for people.
Should we do the left brain, right brain test?
Oh, go on then.
Yeah. Okay. So we're
going to do an exercise, and I'm going to talk about a subject, and there's going to be a moment where it suddenly resonates with you. There's going to be a moment where you go, this is for me right now, and I'm going to explain a subject in 2 different ways. So I'll start, and then when it starts to resonate with you and you go, yep, I get that, my brain has clicked, then you can pop it into the chat, okay?
So just to clarify, so we want to know when you go, oh, that's interesting, that's what we're looking for. So just write yes, followed by which specific part of it, or what was it that resonated with you in that moment.
Well, that's good.
Yeah?
So
I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, perfect, yeah. So this evening I'd like to talk to you about
not using benazepril in patients that are going to be anaesthetised. Benazepril is an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor, and using this drug we use it to reduce circulatory volume in dogs which commonly are undergoing heart failure, or they have myxomatous mitral valve disease. In these patients, we found that clinical studies have suggested that the mean arterial pressure that these patients undergo during general anaesthesia is considerably lower than those patients which have benazepril withheld from them. When I was about 28, I was a resident at the University of Glasgow, and I was anaesthetising a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. It was a really cute little dog, and it had come in because it had Chiari malformation. It was showing signs that we needed to do an MRI of this dog's brain. We anaesthetised the dog, we used acepromazine and some butorphanol, and the dog had had benazepril that morning. And when I anaesthetised it, its blood pressure was really low. Normal blood pressure is down to about 60 millimetres of mercury, mean blood pressure. this dog's blood pressure was 35 millimetres of mercury. And it was pretty scary. I mean, blood pressure that low can be incompatible with life. And the worry is that if I leave this dog right now and I put this dog in the MRI scanner with blood pressure like that, I'm really going to, I'm going to cause some damage to this dog's kidneys, which could have long-term impacts. So we recovered the dog. We decided not to pursue, not to continue the anaesthesia. And the next day we anaesthetised the dog with the same pre-medication, but this time we didn't give the dog any benazepril beforehand. And its mean arterial pressure was 70 millimetres of mercury. It was way higher. And really what this suggests and what this shows is that giving benazepril to dogs before anaesthesia actually means that they might be much more unstable, and it's probably a better idea not to give it before anaesthesia. Right, how are we doing?
Cool, banging. And it was kind of like the results, I think, speaks for themselves. So
Yeah.
when you, and by the way, you're going to get a picture, folks, that I know nothing about veterinary science whatsoever. Toby said a whole heap of really long words that I didn't understand in the first part of it.
I barely understand some of them.
Well, there you go. And so before you switched gears and went into storytelling mode, you had one yes. Catherine. So it's Catherine, I think, who was right up at the right at the start. You said something about arterial something or other, and then she was like, "Bang! I'm in there. I'm engaged."
I wonder if Catherine's in an anaesthetist.
Possibly. And then when you switch gears into storytelling, it's like bang, 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 bang. All of the comments started coming through.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's just the way that we access the stories. So for you as experienced vets, specialists, nurses and paraprofessionals, think about when you are teaching next and when you're designing your courses or your PowerPoint slides. If there's a concept that you can explain to people, and then you can go, here's the minimum amount for this concept. So we're trying to keep what we're doing short, or at least in short sections. Keep it short, and then try and give them the smallest amount you can do to get them to understand it, so the least you can deliver, and then drop in a story. And really what you'll find is that the students go, got it. But if we deliver loads and loads and loads and loads, often by the time they've got to that point, they're kind of overwhelmed and it's too much. So it's just a different way of thinking about it. And we can always say, okay, this is what I'm doing is really complex. We can do part 1, here's a little story, understand this, okay, cool. Part 2, part 3. So we can build up really quite complex topics. We're not just saying keep everything at a really basic level.
Yeah. There was, just as an observation as well, this is something we didn't talk about earlier on, so I knew we were obviously going to do that exercise and get everybody sort of engaged, but what you didn't know was that I was going to just be taking a few notes on your delivery. So now is the time when I'm going to give you some grades here and give you a bit of feedback. So what was really interesting, the first part where you were using all the long words I didn't understand, it was very much like teacher, it felt very robotic. I didn't actually think that you were that excited about it, if that makes sense. I kind of like that, it was just like going through the motions almost. And then what's really interesting is when, you knew when you were going to do it, but when you then flip modes into the storytelling side of things, your pacing changed, your tonality changed, your use of pauses changed, so you slowed right down, your intonation, so when you were teaching, went up. When you were telling stories, you went down because you were much more like just cool, calm and collected in terms of delivering that story, not least because you were more like interested in telling that story because it was a personal experience which you had. Yeah. And the reason why, and I'll talk about pacing and tonality and leadership and things like that when you are doing storytelling in a second. But one of the reasons why that happened was, think about it this way, when you were doing the teaching piece at the start, you were just in one area of your brain and you're kind of out of your body, just in one area of your brain, and it was very logical. Yeah, so it was just step by step by step by step by step. When you went into the storytelling mode, you go straight into where your body is then, your body remembers feelings and emotions, so you're tapping into that. So now you're out of your head and you're in your body. There'll be emotions which will be triggering off. There's memories, so you're going into different areas of your brain. Because you were telling a story, you're naturally tapping into the right-hand side, creative side of your brain, because you're trying to come up with something that's compelling and that's exciting and that is going to be really interesting so that people can get it. The left brain's still working; it's still doing its job, and actually, the left brain is what I call the monkey brain. It kind of just, the story. If you give put 100 monkeys in a room and give them a typewriter, eventually they'll type out a sonnet from Shakespeare, right? The left brain is that logical monkey brain, which is just chipping away. It's the thing which gets you into the shower in the morning. When you start to get more creative and tap into your feelings and emotions and memories, you're using everything, body, all areas of your brain, the works. It's just more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's loads more to talk about with this. I mean, it's
such a big area, and there's so many different areas that you could include in a discussion like this, and it's a shame we kind of haven't got more time, because I'd love to go on to, like, which hormones we activate through our stories and what that means for the way our students are learning, and trying to reduce cortisol secretion and increase oxytocin, endorphins, dopamine, because all those things are appropriate for certain different stories we're trying to tell. Yeah. But it's such a really...
You can't say that and then not give it to them. It's your show. You get to do what you want. So
there's a great speaker called David J.P. Phillips, and if you look him up, he's a great guy. He's a really energetic Swedish chap, David J.P. Phillips. So he's got a great presentation called The Angels and Devils Cocktail. And what he's talking about there is how, when you tell a story, these really advanced storytellers, they don't just tell a story, but they work out what hormone is being released by each individual story. So, for example, if we're trying to build empathy and we're trying to make people really relate to us and trying to get emotions, we can try and tell a story which will release oxytocin, and we can grade our stories according to how much of an effect they have and what hormone we think we're releasing. If we're trying to get people to laugh and feel humour and to feel relaxed, we can get them to release endorphins, and then if we're trying to get them to feel a bit of a rush, we can release dopamine. It's all of these different things we can do, and it becomes quite advanced, some of it. But imagine you employ this stuff in your teaching. It's quite powerful.
Yeah. And another thing, I know this, I'll keep it short and snappy because I know we've got a time sort of scale to work to, but. So one of the things we teach in business, which I think actually transfers quite well into what you do, and especially sort of teaching and training as well, is the use of things like case studies and testimonials. So whenever it's a natural human instinct, we kind of want to deflect attention off ourselves and onto somebody else. It's just a safety mechanism which we've created, which is why if I had to big myself up, I'd find it quite hard. But if I said, Toby, can you give me a testimonial, please? You'd actually find it really easy to shine the spotlight on me and hopefully talk about all the good stuff. Talk about all the good stuff, the good stuff. Ideally. So if you can find a creative way to, and it might be, again, when I talked about using different tools and techniques while you're doing the training and mixing up, so you're tapping into all of the different ways that people learn, actually, get a video from an external, like a third party, or that you can drop in for a minute or two, just to be able to tell that part of the story on your behalf, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because it's in part, it's like basically just down to trust. But I can say that I'm great, but you'd be thinking, well, he's a bit egotistical, isn't he? But if Toby says I'm great, you'd be like, oh, cool, okay, Robin must be great then. And it's just that simple little like differentiator. Robin's good, thank you. But it's just that simple little tools like that we can just bring into our presentations that make all the difference. Yeah,
and it's really interesting because you talk about case studies and testimonials, and I know that in your job, we talk about, okay, I want someone to talk to me about how I work with them and what impact that has. But when you talk to me about case studies, I'm thinking of something completely different. Yeah. So we talked about this event is called Storytelling and Case Studies. So actually, the reason I talked about case studies is because that's the veterinary version of storytelling. We're saying, okay, I had a horse, and the horse came in for general anaesthesia with me. I anaesthetised the horse, and then the anaesthesia went fine, but in recovery, the horse wasn't able to get up properly, and the horse ended up having a pastern fracture, and we had to euthanize the horse. Okay, what went wrong here? How can we analyse it? Let's talk about safety in recovery for equine anaesthesia, because it's notoriously risky. And that's telling a story, because we're saying, okay, this is what happened, this is why you should care about my analysis and my discussion. And it's wrapping it up. And often there is an academic format for case studies, but we're at a time where we can be trying to do things differently. We could, for the next conference presentation you do, well, you could make it really immersive. You could actually tell more of a story about it. You can still get your analysis in there and your points, but using storytelling as part of that, it could be great.
That's something that's really interesting, actually, what you just said there. So you've touched on something probably without realising it, but different people have different perspectives of the same thing. Okay, that's where case studies are. Many people do case studies, for example, from just their own perspective. How other people see that same thing happening could be very different. There's a fantastic author called Matthew Said, who's written a book called Black Box Thinking. I don't know if you read that, do you know the book?
Just downloaded it.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic. I mean, Matthew Said, he wipes the floor with storytelling. He's just the best. And there's in Black Box Thinking, I think there's 3 examples of stories which he tells in there are to describe something called cognitive bias, which is essentially it's just kind of making things work in our favour. We try and make the circumstances work for us. And one of the examples which he uses is this. It's a very sad story, actually. It's not a good. We'll have to find something happy to end on after this, I think, Toby. But there was some very good stuff which ended up, ultimately came out of this. But there was a young woman in her 30s who, mum of 2, she went in for a routine operation. And for this routine operation, it had been documented there were various complications, but one of the challenges was that none of these complications had ever happened together at the same time. It had only ever been one complication that the surgeons had ever had to deal with. In this particular instance, so when they went to intubate her, I think that's the right pronunciation, isn't it? Intubate her. She had lockjaw, so they couldn't get the tube down. And so the doctor and then the anaesthetist and somebody else, they're trying to open her jaw up to intubate her. Meanwhile, one of the nurses is kind of watching the clock, because obviously once they go under for so long without oxygen, it's a problem, clearly. So the nurse had been watching it, timing it, and I think about 7 or 8 minutes in, she then went off to go and get an emergency tracheotomy kit, which is the standard procedure for that. But what happened was the surgeon kind of battered her away because they were so focused on, they lost all notion of time. They were so focused on opening her jaw up because that was the protocol. That was what the book said. This is the process you've got to go through. Very sadly, they eventually they didn't do the emergency tracheotomy. They left it too late, but they brought her back. But she ended up in a coma, and very sadly, about a week later, passed away. Now the doctors, they put their hands at cognitive bias, and they said, well, we did everything we could to save her life because that's what the book said. But when you then started to look at the doctor, his assistant, and the nurses around there, they didn't want to challenge the surgeons because there was hierarchy there. So you've got half a dozen people in the operating theatre who've all got different perspectives of that same thing that happened then. Very sad ending to it. Now the husband of the woman pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and she asked him to do an investigation. And what transpired was that the surgeons didn't want to report it because they were fearful of losing their jobs. What actually transpired was when the husband said, listen, I will do everything within my power to make sure your job is safe, but please share this so this never happens to anybody else again. Because we've got a mum here who's lost her 2 kids and I've lost my wife, and I would hate for another man and children, to have to go through that. So it got investigated, and then they realised that there were the 2 complications that occurred in tandem that led to this woman's passing away. When it then got documented by, I think it was one of the medical journals, and they then now had a process for dealing with these 2 complications at the same time, they then measured how many times it happened in the next 12 months, and they saved 40 lives as a result of it. So you've got the husband, the kids, the surgeon, his assistant, the nurse, all these people with different perspectives looking at the same thing. And I think that's why with case studies, don't just take your own word for it. Go out and like at the very least, if you're doing a case study with an animal and their owner, for example, get both sides of the story, smash them together, and write up one article about it, because those 2 people will be looking at it from completely different perspectives.
Yeah, exactly, and
I think this is a good point to end on. Is that I know that story. I hadn't read Matthew Said's book at that point. But I know that story because I was at the Association of Veterinary Anaesthetists meeting in 2016, and we had a discussion and we had a presentation about that, and we played a video that described the reconstruction, and that video explained what happened, and it got me feeling quite emotional. It's probably oxytocin release.
Yeah.
And you know what the point was? You should be using checklists, because checklists make you remember, okay, the patient's got increased jaw tone, we can't intubate the patient. Okay, what's the next step? Right, can't intubate the patient. Okay, tracheostomy kit. Okay, well that was probably prepared at the pre-induction checklist. Everyone's here. Anaesthetist, is a surgeon here? Yes, we have a surgeon here. So that's why, when we're inducing complex patients in my clinic, we've got, I'm a small animal anaesthetist, and we have lots of dogs that have BOAS, and we have a surgeon there if we've got a really tricky patient, and we have clippers, and we sometimes have the patients prepped, and we can do a tracheostomy if we really have to. But it's exactly the same thing. It's all this stuff that's there. But I cared about that because I heard this story of this mother who died.
Yeah.
So, right, okay. I think it's enough of us waffling on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for watching that. We're going to go into a Q&A in just a couple of minutes, and if you'd like to put your questions into the chat box, we'd be happy to discuss them and talk about those a little bit more. I've got a little bit of a bonus for you, like I said earlier. So if you're feeling a little bit excited about this, it's probably quite a good sign, really, that you probably might want to implement some of these teachings we've been talking about. It's really easy to come on a webinar like this, or to come to a talk and go, oh, that's really cool, I find that's really interesting. But actually implementing it is something that very few people do. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more, and you'd like to implement some of these practices in your teaching, if you're a university, or if you're a CPD company, if you're a company that does general teaching to students or postgraduates, I would love to speak to you. I've opened up a few spots in my diary tomorrow and also next week, and you can book one of those by clicking on the link that's in the chat at the moment. I'd be happy to have a chat with you and just learn a little bit more about your challenges and your goals, and see if we can help you there. Right, Q&A?
Q&A, let's do it.
Okay, right, we've got some questions submitted already. So the first one we have is from Alex, and Alex says, how might storytelling help or hinder someone's learning or training if they identify as a neurodivergent? Okay, so this is somebody with ADHD, ASD, and do you have any examples of when it helped? And that's a really interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think really that goes back to that, remembering that everybody is entirely different, and that left and right brain, and somebody who's neurodivergent, you're dealing with probably even a lot more complex, sort of circumstances altogether. And I think one of the things is, this is my perception of it, and neurodivergent people tend to be much more in that creative space. It's much more of I would say, visual learning and kinesthetic. They're probably not going to sit there for a long period of time just kind of listening to something or watching a presentation. I think it needs to be much more entertaining and much more so they can actually kind of get involved in that learning experience, if that makes sense. That's my interpretation.
Yeah, because it's the trick here is that
there isn't like a magic formula for saying that we're going to teach dyslexic people, or we're going to teach people with ADHD, or people who identify as neurotypical, so those people that we say were normal. But it's about actually delivering what we're doing in a way that should work for as large a group of people as possible. Yeah. So we're trying to hit visual, we're trying to hit auditory, we're trying to hit kinesthetic learning. We can talk about, do you deliver it asynchronously, so beforehand? And then we do a wrap up in person or practical, and then we have some component which is delivered asynchronously afterwards to reinforce that, so we can get activation of prior learning. So it's really about trying to make learning almost more inclusive, actually.
Yeah.
And I think storytelling is it's a tool that it might not work for you, but I suspect that for a lot of people it really will.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. So.
And I was just very quickly, just a mixture of different resources as well, because again, somebody's not going to sit there and just watch a video.
Yeah.
Actually, is there a workbook or something which they can fill out alongside that sort of initial piece of media that you're kind of delivering it with. And like you said, you know, actually kind of, I can't remember, you again used some long words there, but actually like getting your hands dirty and like, you know, like having a practical version of it as well as like the online sort of version of it as well, definitely.
Yeah,
I think blended learning is, particularly in the time that we're at now, doing some learning where we do some learning prior to, and then we have a practical in person, particularly when it's the uncertainty of getting everyone together just for a theory session. Sometimes we don't necessarily have to do that, and it can be really, really helpful.
One of the things I found is also quite interesting is there's something called learning paths where, so again, many traditional forms of like teaching is very linear. We, like in my program, for example, we've got 80 different modules which we use to teach the business owners like the, you know, different business skills. And at the start, and it was a big mistake, I think, we expected people just to work their way through from 1 to 80. Within about 3 months, we got enough data where we saw obviously there was a tail off of people dropping off at different points. But let's say, for example, a majority of people never got to week 9 because, you know, just diminishing returns. They put in so much effort to watch all these videos at that point. The returns they were getting started to diminish, and so there was a drop off. And what we realised was that, say, out of those 80 modules, it's like Pareto principle. There was actually, I mean, I guess for veterinary science, it's a bit different because they really you need to know all of the, you know, yeah, there's prerequisites. What we spotted though was that there was 20% of the content created 80% of the result. Okay, so it pushed the needle the most. And so we were able to identify, and what we didn't do is we didn't just move them to the front. We didn't just take those 10 modules and move them to the front of the course, because actually that wasn't beneficial either. But once we identified these milestones, when a client then comes in with a specific problem, a burning bridge, we can say, great, we'll jump forward to week 9 where we go through sales role play and a 6-step sales process. That's what you need right now. And that will benefit you the most. So, and they're called learning paths. And so what we might do is one client might need week 3, week 9, back to week 7, and then go on to week 12. Another client might come in and it might be like week 10, week 1, week 3. You know, so everybody's different. Yeah, and it's much more prescriptive. And the results were like we initially tested it on just 10 clients. And within the space of about 3 weeks, they were getting double the result of all the clients who were going through it in a linear way. So learning paths was like one of the greatest transformations which we created for our clients. How practical that is, like transferring that across into veterinary practice, I don't know, or learning veterinary science, I don't know, but I'm sure there's probably something in that.
Yeah, but it's really interesting to see it at this sort of point, because you can think
potentially how could we access that? So
yeah.
Okay, right. Richard has said, I have a question on themes. Some of the best speakers I've ever heard seem to be able to link stories via a consistent theme into their lectures. In my experience, this is difficult. Any tips on setting out a theme or a structure of themes into a talk of lectures? Okay, so it's about those people who are the very best lecturers. How can they seem to have a story for everything? So how can you get a theme kind of into your lecture to be able to find a story?
So for me, I have a little black book where I have a coaching tool, from my toolkit that I want to teach, and then 2 or 3 anecdotes to go along with each one of those. So that's kind of my script. That's my storytelling black book. The other thing as well is, and this is me, I'm going to put my coaching hat on here because there's something which I saw in that question, which is very much like there's a rule there that almost we're not allowed to diverge away from the theme. Actually, it's okay to diverge away from the theme at the right time, but it's just, again, giving yourself time to pause to then circle back and bring it back on track. So that was just me catching something from a coaching perspective there based on that question. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of just having a case study or a testimonial or just a little story or an example. And one of the things that people get quite often is imposter syndrome. So they feel they have to own that story. You don't at all, because if you don't have a real life version of it for yourself, guaranteed there's 7.5 billion people on this planet, and there are no new ideas in some respects. What you want to tell a story about has probably happened somewhere. So go and find that story and borrow it.
Absolutely.
Like I did with Matthew Said's, and you've heard it in a different environment as well altogether. So I would never I would never take Matthew Said's example and call it my own. I'll always credit him with that, and I think that's quite important as well, because where there is a good idea and a strong story, I feel you should always credit the person at where it's come from.
And I think the thing is
that what you might do is you might have a lecture where you're thinking, oh, I don't have a story for this, but actually it might be something like, you're trying to explain something where you can go, do you know what, I found this particular subject really hard to learn, and it's okay. Like a classic is, teaching students, buprenorphine and butorphanol. I don't have a story for those, but they sound just the same. Yeah. So sort of like, do you know what, I feel where you're coming from. I find it hard to learn these two, and you can sometimes empathising with them or just explaining it in a different way.
That works very well as well.
Ask the audience as well, because I know that they're your students, but my coaching clients, I find sometimes I'm coaching myself during the process of coaching them, so actually asking them, what experiences they've had, and give them the microphone, allow them to stand up and tell their stories as well. Like, don't feel you've got to do all of the work. Yeah. Lo and behold, they might tell it better and more entertaining way and actually get through to all of the other students in the room as well. That's actually like a really positive thing. So we can share in their success.
Right. Okay.
This is an interesting one. Okay. So Leanne Stagg has asked, so are there any ways to make a dry topic like legislation and prescribing more interesting? So I think this is an interesting one actually, because like when we look at the concepts in your book, which is like how to like price your services and how to make a product out of your business. Like, it's not particularly exciting, but like,
so how do we take something that is pretty dry and make it interesting?
Well, if I told you that as a result of Russ productizing his service, he doubled his income within the space of about 3 weeks, are you slightly more interested now? Yeah. So first of all, focus on the outcome or result. Yeah. But then it's also like, what was the journey that the character in that story was going through at the time when he was productizing? It's not about productizing a service. It's about his experiences. So then when you start to break it down, so Russ is actually a real character, by the way. So he was one of my first coaching clients. So it's a true story up until about page 74. Then I have artistic license around his goals. Okay, so. That he shared with me, and actually he has gone on to since achieve some of those since I've written the book as well. So, but getting to the outcome or results is actually a story within itself. Okay, so in Russ's case, he had somebody show up to his golf, for golf lessons, and Russ was like he was asking the wrong questions. So he was asking questions like, and hopefully there's some relevance here. He was asking questions like, how long have you played golf for? What golf clubs do you use? When can you start lessons? Some like practical questions, but they weren't linked to an outcome or result. And I was like, Russ, you've got to come up with some kind of like a clear and specific measurable outcome or result. Why are people coming to play golf with you? And we got most of the way through a coaching session. Then 5 minutes from the end, he like blurted out. He's like, "Oh, Rob, I think I understand what you're saying now." He said there was this guy who just got a new job who came to have golf lessons with me. I was like, "Okay, tell me more." He's like, "Well, he just got given a sales role for a 2,500 person company, and the reason he wanted golf lessons was because before he even set foot in the office, they'd given him an assignment, and that was to go and play a round of golf. But the round of golf was with the CEO of the company, a 4-ball with the CEO of the company, right? So he's like, all I wanted to do was like drive 30 yards further and straight down the middle of the fairway so that CEO noticed me." It's like, wow, Ross, that's your value proposition. That's why people come and play golf with you. Like, so all of a sudden that, like, if you can get people from not playing golf to impressing their CEO of their company so they get a promotion and get bigger bonuses and things like that, make that the thing which you're selling. And all of a sudden it's very different to product, like you said, productizing your services, pricing. It's about finding a hook that is going to engage with people, that your audience is going to understand, that, that they can kind of go on that journey and go, I get it, that's what I can do.
Because it might be for...
We'll go back to legislation. It might be that there's something in there like, what's the reason behind the legislation? There might be that, okay, we're trying to reduce, disease which is occurring in, disease that occurs, in a certain area, or we're trying to prevent, medicines that aren't appropriate to be used in animals going into the food chain. Well, what's the main reason behind that? Is there something that isn't in there for, a case that happened or some case law? And actually, just trying to explain that, because we're trying to say an interesting story, but all we're trying to say is you've got a concept. Can you try and find a way of, explaining that from a different angle? And you might kind of find it kind of comes together. So.
Yeah, I mean, thinking legislation, insurance, is that piece of legislation there, going to save 1,000 lives? Is it going to prevent, £1 million lawsuits? Is it going to, that's a very American term, isn't it? It's things like that. So we can picture saving 1,000 lives. We can picture what £1 million looks like, So like, think about the outcome result. Like, yes, legislation is boring, but try and put it in a way that people can really kind of like see.
Yes, exactly. Right, there are. So we have got one question from Lizzie Lockett. So, to what extent do you think that encouraging people to reflect on what they have learned and its impact on them, emotional or otherwise, helps them to create their own narrative, which in turn helps them to embed the learning more strongly? So Lizzie is asking if we get people to reflect on their learning. So this is flipping it again, because this is getting them to find their own story. Yeah. How does it help with their learning? That's really, because like reflection is a part of training that we have to do. We have to do a lot of as vets, as part of our CPD, or undergraduates have to do it in postgraduate training. But like, how does it improve learning?
So this is where we had a joke earlier on, wasn't it, about your fake fern over there? That's exactly what I was referring to. So I thought it's a very real looking fern. It's not a real fern. It's a plastic fern. But my point was, so I asked, as an example, like, if we just give people the blueprint, there's a real lack of creativity in that. So when you invite people to step outside their comfort zone with not all of the pieces of the puzzle being presented, you have to come up with creative ways to solve problems. And that's where growth and evolution basically comes from. People find creative new ways to solve meaningful problems. So I was using the example of the fern earlier on, where I was like, listen, I could tell you, what pH levels to, if it was real, what pH levels to, for the soil to be at, how much water to give it, how many times a day or week to water it, what nitrates, nutrients you needed to feed it. So all of these different things. But ultimately, if I said, well, the goal is to keep the plant alive, you figure out how to do it, you could come up with something very different to my blueprint that actually means that the plant doesn't just stay alive, but maybe it grows 30% during the same time period. So it evolves and there are better results. So if you leave people to their own devices to plug some of those gaps, they will come up with something a lot more creative than just ordinarily the blueprint you would have given them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and ultimately, I think the point is that
for reflection particularly, what we're doing is we're making people take something, and rather than passively learn it, we're making them absorb it, think about it, and making it stick, and it can be quite, it can be a really powerful way to learn. So.
Yeah.
So I think we are pretty much at the end. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Thank you for coming tonight, Robin. It's really great to kind of have one of my heroes on the event. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate the audience. It's honestly humbling to see people so interested and really all over the world. If you'd be interested to find out how to implement some of these techniques with your teaching, if you're an organisation, a university or a CPD company, please do book a slot to have a chat with me tomorrow or over the next week. It'd be great to have a chat with you. And if you'd like to email me with other topics that you're interested in, I'd be happy to look into those and see what we can do for our next event. Thank you very much.